Lammy, it's been a long time since we talked about a game. I was a few minutes late today. Would you like to know why?
Sure, of course I'd like to know why.
Because I was playing Dome Keeper. So I had half an hour on my calendar today to prepare for this discussion about Dome Keeper, and I thought I opened a bunch of articles and some reviews, and I was going to read them, and I was getting ready because I haven't fully gone into this what's been called a tower defense roguelike. Although it's like a reverse tower defense, you're defending a dome from beneath. Well, I guess you're digging. No, I guess it's a tower defense, although it's just a dome defense, whatever. I don't know what I'm talking about. And I had prepared a bunch of material for me to look into because I haven't gotten fully into the game. Like I haven't spent 50 hours and unlocked everything and tried everything out, like the assessor instead of just the engineer, which you start with. And I thought I'll just play a couple minutes just to get that feel for the game because I haven't played since last week. Just to kind of remind myself of what it feels like to hit blocks and to find new treasure and bring it up to the dome. And I had to finish my run because I found the artifact and I had to defend my tower. And I thought, you know what? I'm pretty powerful this time. I might be able to fend off the final wave. I got completely crushed, but I couldn't. I had to have 5 more minutes. And for me, that is a pretty good description of this game. Just a few minutes more, which is funny because in our last conversation where we talked about addiction, one way we defined it was is when you just want a few minutes more and just a few more things and just the next level up or whatever, and that can be trouble. But for me, this game was not trouble. I'm not. I can control my how much I play with this, and I'm very interested in it, and I'm interested to hear what you think of it and what you've thought of playing Dome Keeper.
Yeah, I think when I told you that I might have something potentially troubling as the last discussion came to a close, is because it definitely, once you start kind of a run, you feel like you need to finish it. It's one of those, I think all of these roguelikes, there's that feel that if you start one, you have to finish it because if you try to come back to it another time, you know it's going to be a disaster. You kind of are totally out of the groove if you come back later. And it can be quite long. So Relic Hunt, which is sort of the um, first way that you can play the game, has a pretty set finish point. But there's also Prestige mode, which is just infinite until you die, really. So it's just about going for as long as you can and getting as high a score as you can. And some of those runs can be quite long, so probably good to stick to Relic Hunt. And I've been enjoying it as well. I find it oddly sort of meditative, just calming. Like even though it's got the time aspect and kind of the stress of having to defend the dome, the music and sort of the atmosphere in the game is sort of very relaxing in a way.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like if we compare it to Slay the Spire, another roguelike that we've talked about, I don't have to think about my moves so much in this game. I just have to move. The key objective or the key ingredient is time, and the key objective is to manage time. So if you're just sitting there thinking about your move, which you can do in Slay the Spire, you can spend 20 minutes figuring out which card you're going to play. That is a different feeling than playing this game, which is just go, just hit blocks, and if you don't know what to do, just pick a direction and go. And obviously, and I have started it up again after going halfway through, I've lost the groove for what I was doing. And just like, I was moving in this direction, left or right or down or in a certain area, and I forgot that I had collected iron over here and I was waiting to pick it up. But I don't, it's less, I guess, less cerebral. I'm not planning it out as much, or at least in the stage of play that I'm in. Obviously, I can see how running up the tech tree and mining in a certain way can be more cerebral, but there's a certain impetus to go in this game, which I find powerful. But here's the interesting thing: I didn't like it at first. I found, and it is like an arcade game. There's the music, the sound, even the nostalgic feeling of the game, a throwback to another time. But there's just the style of play, which is somewhat tactile, but managing time, and there's always a counter of the enemies coming. It feels like an arcade game. And my first reaction was, oh man, I'm not going to be any good at this. I'm not used to playing, and I don't want to become good at hitting my mouse in a certain way. But I realized that it's less about how you hit the keys. That was the first hump I had to get over, and more about, again, managing time and how you're going to use your time. And if you're going to, do you have time for one more run to hit a few more blocks, or are you going to just stay put and defend the dome? Or are you going to let your dome get a little bit damaged by spending just a bit more time to get a few more iron or water or cobalt on this run? And that is fascinating, and it is cerebral, but just in a more forward-facing, less laid-back sort of way. And I came to really enjoy it. But my first reaction was, "Oh man, do I have to? How many hours of this do I have to play?"
Yeah, so I thought what you would really appreciate about it is the strategy. So, yes, it's time management, but a lot of it is decisions around how to scale. So, like a lot of roguelikes, you have to outscale the enemy. Like in Slay the Spire or even the Binding of Isaac or whatever it is, it's often a you versus the game, whatever the enemy or the antagonistic part of the game is. It's getting harder and you have to get stronger fast enough. You have to outpace it, and where those decisions lie and how you do that is, I think, the interesting strategic part that I thought you would like. So, you know, how much do you pump into your drill speed, let's say, versus screw it, I'm just going to do my best to find the artifact really quickly, or I'm going to make my attacks really, really strong so that I can kind of take my time mining route. But obviously everything takes resources. So you're sort of deciding where do you put those resources and what kind of run are you building. And I think prestige mode takes that to a especially strong strategic point of view, because at that point, you have to actually decide, do I put resources into increasing my score, or do I have to get stronger? So you kind of have to make a choice. Are you trying to scale your resource production as quickly as possible so that you can pump your score later? Or do you kind of do piecemeal, a little bit of this, I'm going to put a little bit into upgrading myself and upgrading my guns or my sword, and also send a little bit of score. And I think that's the interesting sort of part of the game that I thought you would especially like, rather than the more active part of playing it, is just when do you do certain things? When do you upgrade certain things? It has that sort of, maybe those resource management type games that you do like, where you have to make a decision about, okay, when do I start swapping into thinking about more offensive versus defensive, whatever that might be.
Yeah, and asking for me, like, what's my meta? Like, what is my standard of play? Am I always going to upgrade myself? I mean, that's what I eventually realized I was always going to do, was upgrade my engineer's speed, carry capacity, and drill strength, because resource management is the one thing that's going to be able to keep up. If you keep upgrading your laser or your sword, it doesn't matter. Eventually, they're going to be more powerful than you can possibly become, because you're just not collecting enough stuff. You've got to go down and do that. So I think, well, at least that's my amateur perspective of it, or just my standard of playing. But you're right. And those decisions were immediately pressing upon me and pressing upon the player, because you start out with nothing. You don't even know how soon the enemy is going to come and attack your dome. You have no aim line on your gun. And there are some things I was wondering, once you get to a certain level, do good players forego these things? Do they no longer need an aim line on their gun because they're just so used to aiming it? Do they no longer need a counter because they just intuitively know when the next one is coming? Then again, the counter is so cheap that eventually you're probably going to buy it. In my last run, the reason I thought I could defeat the final wave was because I had a lot of resources, and I was almost had an abundance to spend. Of course, I didn't buy everything, but I thought, oh wow, I'm actually able to hold off and not buy this to buy something really big. And I hadn't had that opportunity before, but of course I still got completely crushed. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think that whole concept of scaling, which is, deeply embedded with the idea of a roguelike, like you've said, is interesting to me. But at first, it feels oppressive, because all of these things feel so far away, and the enemy. It just feels inevitable that the enemy will scale up from me and get kind of run away from me. But I didn't know when I first started playing too the objective. I didn't know I needed to find an artifact. There's no tutorial. Going back to our episode on tutorials, you just start digging. And I loved that. But because I didn't know what I was doing, I guess my first impression was I just stay alive forever, and I didn't know why. And I think, in prestige mode, you've overcome that, and you're also building a high score, which again is going back to the arcade concept of just getting a high score. The original purpose of expert gaming, not a speed run, not a perfect run, but just getting the best possible score. Yeah, do you prefer a prestige run, or do you prefer the relic hunt?
So I haven't unlocked prestige on my save yet, but I'm very aware of the mechanics and how it works. I think that eventually I would probably just want to move on to prestige mode, and I wouldn't really have a use for relic hunt, because once I think you've beaten it enough times on all the difficulties and map sizes and with all the different gadgets, what is there really left to do? And it's, this game scratches that itch of becoming as efficient as possible, right? Making having the perfect round, essentially, which is again what I thought you would like about it. And it does mix a bit of actual physical mechanics into that, but it's still, at the end of the day, I think, a decision-based game in, what should I do right now based on everything I have? What is the next best, most optimal thing to sink resources into? What you said, can I afford to take a bit of damage this time, like not upgrade something because I know I'm going to heal, and with the sword dome or whatever it is, the buying the health upgrade actually heals me fully. And there's like all of these decisions, and I think prestige mode is where you can really test those out, because you have that extra layer of what resources am I using for score. And it's not just finishing the tech tree, which is a finite thing that you can do. Although I do believe, I say finite, I do believe, and I could be wrong about this, in prestige mode and maybe even the regular game, there are certain upgrades that you can repeatedly buy. They just get more and more expensive. So like drill strength and some of those, you actually max them out and you can just keep going. They just get increasingly more expensive because things do scale. Like even the block strength kind of scales to the point where you buy an upgrade and you still feel like you're taking forever to mine things. So yeah, I think prestige mode is the way the game is sort of intended to be played, if that makes sense. But it starts with this relic hunt as a way to get you familiarized with concepts and the kind of decisions you have to make. And it's also just a mode that is quicker. So like if you only have a little bit of time, you could do that, and you could change, the map size and the difficulty to accommodate that. And I really like that they've added in all of those options. They've also recently added a bunch of modifiers to the game, which I haven't tested out. And the Assessor only just came out. So when they first released the game, it was just the Engineer. So one type of mining. And I tried to play one run on the Assessor, and I hated every second of it so much, because I am still so much like you. And immediately the mechanics were really hard for me. I still don't understand exactly how to use it. Like mechanically speaking, the mining is completely different. And I found it so difficult, and I got so frustrated. I'm like, I just wanted a calming little mining. I just wanted to get down here and feel the blocks breaking, and the plink plonky sounds of bringing water up to my base is really nice. And I didn't need any of this headache. But I'm sure that feeling will go away, just like it did for you, once I get a little bit more comfortable with it.
Well, it's interesting, right? Like at the beginning, I also thought that it really mattered how quickly I hit the space bar to go onto my console and hit D to go into upgrades, or hit A to start the fight or whatever. Like I thought that those split second decisions really did matter, and they do probably more down the line. But they're not as important as bigger decisions, which is nice. The bigger is more important than the smaller. In some games, sometimes it feels like the tiny little things are the most important and the big concepts are lost in the avalanche of the small. In this game, the bigger decisions are more important. So do you spend time hitting the blocks that it takes 6 hits to get through? Or do you just focus on the easier stuff until you've upgraded your drill? Well, there might be something behind just a few of those blocks. In fact, there is. Or you just complete your route or whatever. And those decisions are more important at this point for me than the little tactility, than the how quickly I do this, or how if I don't, get up to my base in a perfect straight line or something like that. And those things evolve. And so in a way, the game is, I guess, not just rewarding, but forgiving of those little things, and until they become more important later, that the small scales up to the big at a later stage. And I liked that. And there's a sense in this game of there is something calming. And I don't know what that is, because I get really pissed off sometimes that I have to go back up to the top and fight these stupid creatures it's a very two-dimensional game. These creatures are very similar. There's harder and more difficult creatures that come out, but you're just shooting them with your laser or cutting them with your sword, and you're just keeping your dome alive. It's not rich in story. It's not complicated. And yet I think without that element, having to come back up to the top of the dome, I'm not just going to hit a bunch of blocks for thousands of hours. That's what makes the game work. And it doesn't have to be complicated. I have a really stupid game on my phone that I've sunk hours into, and I've put away for years and come back to. It's called Ballz. Ballz. It's so dumb. You shoot balls at blocks and you stay alive forever. There's no goal. You could have 1,000 balls that you're shooting because you've gone through 1,000 levels. You try to, again, scale up faster than your enemy is scaling up against you. I don't know what it is, but I just sometimes open it up and can sink in half an hour into it with the same kind of impulse as I play this game, Domekeeper, but maybe kind of the same reward, which is just I get to relax for a few minutes until I go past a point where I'm no longer relaxing and I'm just getting addicted, right? There is that point that I pass. Do you get that? I mean, we've talked about this before, but do you get that to that point ever, and do you pass it, or do you usually say, no, I'm good, I'm going to do something else?
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of game. Definitely can happen. And like, for example, I could imagine it happening more with prestige mode. I can't really see that in Domekeeper with Relic Hunt, because it just, you could play, but I don't think there's that. It doesn't get longer and longer, and therefore more of a time sink. At some point, you play and you finish, and that's a satisfying sort of play session. And especially as you, like right now, there's a lot of I'm unlocking things, so there's different things to try, and that's interesting. But I think it's when you get into the kind of endless modes that it can become more of an issue. And you talked earlier about whether some of the upgrades, for example, better players just don't bother sinking resources into. I think that's definitely true the more you play the game. Like, for example, I think I bought the sights once. I've never purchased the 1 resource cost or 2 resource costs or whatever it is that tells you how many resources you have when you're not at your base.
Same. And I've never purchased the how many waves you've survived.
Yeah, like that's just for fun. I think those are just for fun. And I kind of like that they've mixed in, good upgrades with just for fun upgrades, or, it's kind of interesting that they've chosen to do that. But I definitely think, yeah, you get to make a choice of how are you playing. Are you playing specifically super optimally for resource usage? And then you can even make an argument, like you said, for not even buying the wave timer, and just become very good at being able to tell, or making sure you're never too far away from the top when you need to be. I, for example, do always buy that one. I don't always buy it super early, because some of the early waves, there's just not a lot of risk. There's 1 or 2 enemies. So even if I'm late, it's not going to be a big deal. But the later it goes, I've actually I had a situation earlier on where I couldn't figure out how to use the teleporter. Like, I just wasn't hitting the button properly. I don't know what was happening. And I died just because I literally couldn't get back to base. I assumed that I could have because I had the teleporter and I was really far away. And then I couldn't hit the button. And I just kept teleporting back down to where I was all the time. Like, nothing was working properly. And it didn't take long for my entire dome to be destroyed. just because it was later on. So those, like if I didn't have a timer, sometimes just a few seconds, it can be disastrous. So yeah, I think in general, right, the better you are at something, the less of those crutches you need, of the extra helpers. If you are somehow absolutely perfect with defense, you probably don't necessarily need extra defensive upgrades or offensive upgrades if you can just mechanically be very good at it. But that's not the same for, let's say, mind speed, because at some point you literally can't get the blocks, and you do need that upgrade. So it is just sort of interesting, and I think that a game like this would continue to be interesting until, like you said, you just go, oh, I'm just mining. Like you no longer have anything, and for me anyway, I no longer have anything I'm exploring or discovering as new, because that is still my primary reason for playing anything. So trying out different things and different ways of playing and seeing if I could win that way. When I run out of those sort of permutations that are interesting, I'll probably be done. But I was curious to know what your favorite dome and gadgets were.
Well, so first of all, I think there might be a developer schema here where that will try to counter what you just said. So, because I agree, once I've kind of unlocked everything, why would I keep playing? But I think what they're trying to do is almost like taking off a plane. Like, you're scaling up, you're unlocking things, you're learning about the game. And by the time you get there, you feel so good at it and you've done it so much that you just have to keep playing, and then you start playing for a high score. And inevitably, because you've put so much time into it, you shouldn't be too terrible to get high scores. So, it's like the discovery is leading to that next phase where you're kind of flying. And then hopefully the game will continue to evolve and add new things, which is common now in game design, where they're just kind of roping you back in with new things. That might be the intention, but in this respect, I think all planes must land. Like, no one's going to play this game forever for the next 50 years unless they continually add to it and evolve and grow the game. Yeah, in terms of my favorite gadgets and things, I mean, again, I go back to what I like to do. So I like having a second gun, the automated gun, because I don't like fighting, and I feel like I'm terrible at it and I'm not aiming at the right things. So if I have something helping me out, that's good. I find that I guess I like the teleporter, but I haven't figured it out yet how best to use it. The condenser just feels good, even though I never seem to need water, right? I always seem to have an overabundance of water. And so it kind of feels like a waste, but it just feels like the right thing to do, like just more resources for nothing. So yeah, I don't like the sword dome. I much prefer the gun, the laser dome. But here's an interesting question, which I wonder if at higher levels, well, I'm sure the game must get to, but maybe as it continues to expand and evolve, this will become more important, which is synergy, something we talked a lot about with Slay the Spire. And other games like this. I'm not really playing with synergy right now. I'm playing with time management. I'm playing with which blocks do I hit? How soon do I go back up to the dome? How many runs can I get per enemy attack? And which direction am I going to go? And am I going to focus on going sideways or up and down, whatever? I'm not really focusing on, okay, the teleporter really works well with the elevator, right? And because I'm just not that far into the game yet. I haven't leveled up that far. But I wonder what synergies there are at later levels when, different gadgets work well together and produce incredible synergies that maybe even the developers have to come in and say, whoa, we're going to have to nerf that. It's just game breaking. And I don't know. I actually don't know if the game allows for that kind of thinking, if it's that complex. Have you experienced anything with synergy in that way?
Yeah, there is definitely a tiny bit of synergistic effects in what I've played. Really, it's more to do actually with the condenser, because the condenser has an upgrade that lets you auto overcharge your dome. So I don't know if you've gotten far enough into playing to actually unlock new abilities, so dome abilities. So, for example, I think it's on. Is it the repellent or the sort. I don't remember what it's on, but there's one that when you first start, it's got kind of a slow effect. So there's a battle ability that lets you slow enemies. But
Yeah, the
there's
repellent. Yeah.
so then there's a different battle ability that actually withers, so like does damage to them instead. And you don't have that when you first start. It's something that gets unlocked. And the way the overcharge works on your dome is that one of the upgrades after you first put into overcharge is that overcharge usually makes your base gadget do more. So like your repellent can last longer or take less time to recharge. But a later upgrade lets you boost your battle ability as well. So usually the duration. So you can have like a really, really long wither, let's say, and that synergizes quite well with the automatic overcharge. So you kind of have that, am I going to wait? I can buy overcharge now, but then I have to pump water into it, but I need water to get the automatic overcharge. So can I wait long enough to get 5 water to get the automatic overcharge, but I'm losing all the, potential overcharge in the meantime. And there's some of that. And then, they do synergize in that way, which can be quite bonkers. Like you can get some pretty ridiculously long, like, there's another battle ability that's invulnerability. And you can get that to be like really long, and you can, actually use it multiple times during battle, and to the point where you're just really not taking much damage at all during a fight. And I think the more obvious Dome Keeper synergy is actually anti-synergy. I think there's more anti-synergies than there are synergies, if that makes sense. So I don't know if you've noticed, but you can only hold 2 gadgets sort of in the basement of your dome. But there's a few gadgets that don't count towards that. So the stun laser, which is the one that you said you liked, that is the second sort of automatic laser, doesn't count towards a limit because it doesn't live inside your dome. Same with the lift, the elevator, it doesn't live inside your dome. So there's a few gadgets you can kind of take knowing that they don't affect your overall limit. And so there's a bit of anti-synergy depending on what you've taken, because once you fill those up, you can never get sort of another option there. And the lift and the teleporter are sort of anti-synergistic in that they both sort of, you could synergize them together in some ways depending on how you build them, but teleporter incentivizes you to sort of dig really deep and use the teleporter to help you out. Whereas lift incentivizes the opposite, because it takes so long for resources to travel up the lift. You actually want a short lift, and you want to kind of dig horizontally, and you want to balance sort of your depth and your horizontal mining so that it doesn't take you too long to bring things to the lift, but it doesn't take the lift too long to bring them to the surface. So it kind of would be weird to try to build them both. Now, I still think that there are ways that would work. But yeah, it hasn't yet, I think, evolved into these crazy, completely overpowered synergistic runs. And I think part of that reason is because they are going towards a prestige sort of endless mode. And a lot of other roguelikes that let you get ridiculously overscaled have an end still, right? So it's just about, can you beat it when you get to the hardest bit? Even with Relic Hunt, like you said, you tried to beat the final wave, even though you don't have to. You win, right? As long as you have the relic. The relic does all the work for you. But of course I tried to do the same thing. I think it's like human instinct to just be like, oh, okay, there's got to be an achievement for this, right? For beating the final wave, even when you have the relic. But in an endless mode, you kind of, I don't think, can let synergies get too out of control.
That makes sense, actually, now that you mention that. Like, I think synergies go well with a finite end. But it would be game breaking or it would either be game breaking or it would just become the meta that everybody uses, and it almost becomes boring. Like there's no rock, paper, scissors element. It's just what everyone does. Like when you say the elevator, in an endless game, you can make the elevator really long and then you have a really continuous stream of resources. But that's not the best expenditure of your time. That the best expenditure of your time and resources is to play by the standard that has been given to you. Whereas in a more, I don't know if I would call it more complex game, but maybe in a more finite game like Slay the Spire, there are new ways of playing things that there are so many potential synergies that you might discover one in this particular run through that no one else has thought of before, or that is really quite powerful, that is surprising because it just so happens that that's the random hand that you were given. It's interesting. Like before chatting with you in this series, I had very little exposure to roguelikes. I didn't even really know what they were, frankly. And now I think it's definitely a style of play and a way that I want to feel. Like it's something that I can do for 20 minutes sometimes. And it will, it never is 20 minutes. It's usually longer than that. But I feel like, oh, I've got a bit of time. I can do this. That's like playing Ballz on my phone. I feel so stupid even mentioning that. Like it's like a sin that I've committed and I commit on my dumb phone every day. But it's something that I can just do really quickly, as opposed to a story heavy game where it's like sitting down to watch a movie. Like you want to be able to focus and pay attention and be with it for a little while. But I appreciate this, because if all the games that I have known were, needing me to sit down and pay attention, well, that's a very particular kind of gaming that I can't always do. It's nice to know that there are other opportunities for me, not just to experience games, but to unwind or wind up or learn something. And that's I hadn't planned to ask this question, but in the questionnaire, I always ask people, what do they learn from games? What do games teach them? And I wonder, is there anything, I remember with Slay the Spire, we talked about synergy and learning about expanding your mind in a sort of way to maximize what you have in front of you. Do you think there's a particular kind of learning happening with Dome Keeper, or are they just trying to get players to have, forget that the developers are trying to make you learn or not. Do we learn something in playing this game, or is it pure just joy and adrenaline and calm?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think the learning is the strategy of the game and what I find very interesting about it. But I don't know if it teaches you anything besides how to play the game better, right? Like I obviously there's learning in that. But for example, I'm with you in that in general I don't like time constraints. I didn't used to really enjoy these kind of like more mechanics games, even though this isn't really that mechanically heavy. But obviously in the last however many years, I must have learned to enjoy them, because I now seem to play a fair amount of sort of action or arcade or those kinds of games. And it's taught me how to get over that sort of fear of like a time constraint, or the fact that I have to get good at something, and just sort of find the things that are worth, like I want to play the game enough that I will get through the uncomfortable feeling of, wow, I don't like the fact that I constantly have to be interrupted from the mining, the nice relaxing thing where I'm perfectly making my little mine just to go back up and fight monsters. Because it does teach you that, what, you're right, it would not be fun in the long term. I would not be able to maintain. It would be that kind of game, like I said, where I grow too quickly, too fast, too big too quickly, and just get bored, because I realize at the end of the day I'm just mashing a button to hit pixels on a screen, and that you need that other bit of conflict essentially for it to be interesting. And on a grander scale, I think Domekeeper helps in that learning. Like, okay, you need to manage these things. You can't just be doing only one thing. And coming back to Cult of the Lamb that we talked about before, it had a similar vibe too, where it had these kind of two disparate games, right? There was the cult management part of the game, and there was the dungeon crawling roguelike part of the game. And you needed both, and it meant that it made each one not get boring, right? Neither was super, super deeply developed. It was supposed to be the balance between the two. You've done a little bit of one, now you have to go do the other. And it's been interesting to see games play off of this more, be able to sort of give really, really good feeling experiences just from managing two styles of play that normally wouldn't have necessarily been put together. And I think one thing that I really wanted to talk about with Domekeeper is what makes it feel good. And even for me, how have I learned to kind of like these more mechanics games, or like real-time games, as opposed to ones where I can take turn-based, like Slay the Spire. And a lot of it is the tactility of it and how good it feels to just play. And you don't get that as often with turn-based games, though it depends. Like Slay the Spire, I talked about how good it just feels to play the cards, and Inscription had that. There's the tactility of it. But that's also what I really, really enjoy about Dome Keeper. The music is fantastic. The sound design is just so charming. The kind of way the little resources all make their own little sounds, and they've skinned, the map. So even if it's the same map, you kind of get different colors of the same resources depending on each time you roll. You also, by the way, get different difficulties of monsters and different breakdowns of enemies based on which of those skins you're on. So some of them have like more ranged, or it kind of depends how it goes. You kind of get biomes, which is a neat way for them to introduce a bit more randomness and potentially affect your strategy each time you play. The better you get at it. But they've done a great job, I think, like in setting the mood when you get into it, and just again, the sound design I think is a big part of it, but the visuals that they've done as well really go with it, and I think help with that relaxing sort of meditating feel that then once in a while pulls you into a stress, right? You get to these moments of like, oh, I thought I was strong enough and this wave was just that much stronger. And they definitely manage that feeling by having easier and harder waves throughout. So it doesn't just scale up. You will also get easier waves at times, even later in the game. And I think a lot of what it's trying to teach you in that way is just how to manage your play. Like you said, manage your time, your resources, which a lot of games have been doing for a long time, but it's just doing it in a slightly different form factor, right? The mechanics are slightly different. The feel is slightly different, because at the end of the day, the mental thinking that we're doing, strategizing what to do next, is kind of the same in any of the games. You are just finding the optimal path. What the optimal path is depends on the game and your mechanics of it game, but the thinking is often similar. You're just learning what are the mechanics of this game. It's really not that dissimilar to Slay the Spire, right? What's the best thing I can do with what I have in front of me?
There's, for me, the key to what makes this game successful is the balance of how you are going to strategize. So even in the fights, you have to strategize in a similar way. You're not prioritizing, you're not dealing with time, but you are prioritizing your targets. Are you going to, because it takes time to move your laser from left to right. So are you going to focus on the right side of the screen, but when a big, huge guy comes up on the left, are you going to move your laser over? Are you going to finish what's going on the right? Or, making these decisions in very short periods of time is important. But how the developers were able to balance this is interesting, because, as you say, they could have, or as I'm thinking, they could go too far. If the mining became a little bit too complex, where you're building things in the mine, not just elevators and teleporters, but other apparatuses that can help you mine better, then the mine becomes a precious thing that you see differently, and you don't want to get to the end in the same way, and you don't want to deal with the enemy anymore. It's less exciting to get to the enemy. It's like less exciting to get to the end as well. It becomes more like a toy, like Townscaper or something. There's also the pressure, I think, that the developers must face when it comes to automation, right? Like, you can automate certain things. You can automate that secondary laser. You can even automate it to the point that it will fight for you when you're not even there, although it's probably not going to do very well for very long. You can automate the collection of the resources from the condenser, but there's just a few things. Some games take this to the extreme, where you automate everything, and really all you're doing is managing the automation. So an example of this is Factorio, where you are just assembling this, and it's similar. You're fighting aliens on a planet and staying alive, but you're just assembling this enormous city of automation and factories that are collecting resources and turning them into other things. And at some point, for a lot of players, they just turn off the enemies. They turn off the fight, because it becomes about building something. But as soon as you do that, you're accepting that your game has changed into something else. And I think that's a big risk that some games take, and some of the times it would pay off. But with this game, I don't know if it would. And, again, the sound design, to go back to that, is excellent. But it also sometimes helps with the play. So when you're hitting blocks, if you can't quite see what kind of block it is, the sound will tell you. But sometimes it's just really cool, like the blood rain. Like, the first time I saw that, I just thought, this is a good game. This is fun. It's not adding to the mechanics. It's total mood. And yet I was there for it and appreciated that. And so, again, the balance between those things that, like in the tech tree, that aren't really necessary but are just fun, and the things that are necessary for becoming good and scaling up as fast as the enemy. So yeah, balance, I think, for me is what they've achieved with this and why they were so successful. When it launched in September 2022, it was a huge success. It became profitable within a matter of hours. It clearly delivered something that people were looking for. Um, Anything else you want to say about or talk about with Domekeeper?
Just that I'm pretty impressed with everything they've managed to add into it. I know in one way we talked about how simplistic it is, but I think the more you play and the more you unlock, you realize there's actually a lot of mechanics. So one thing we didn't touch on is there are also other randomly scattered things that can impact your run within the mine. So there's seeds that can grow resource trees. There's little fruit that can improve your mining ability and speed that respawn. There's one-way teleporters. I don't know how many of these things that you've found, but there are some neat extras in there. And I think that they've done a great job of extensibility. So being able to add maybe new map types or new types of, I guess, miners like that you actually control, new game modes. They could add new things to the mines, right? Like new interesting randomized events. And all of that would make the game sort of feel fresh all the time. And I think they've done a really, really great job of a balance, like you said, of a sort of framework of a game that they could really easily add on to and make it that much more fun. They've clearly put a lot of thought into the atmospheric aspect of this that both of us really appreciate. So yeah, I'm just, it's not one of the best games of all time. It wasn't like a hugely, but it was a game that was well done and I think has a place, is not really like derivative in a specific way, like obviously is a roguelike and fits certain kind of stereotypes, but still plays and feels unique and worth being out there. And it's always impressive to me, just when it comes to art and ideas, how humans can keep coming up with new ones. And you think, yeah, like that's an obvious game that could have existed. How come it didn't exist until now? So just thought it might be something fun to try out, and maybe it'll help a little bit with getting over some of your fear of moving a character around and doing some of those mechanics in real time. And this is how you get to maybe not being so freaked out about these Outer Wilds type flying around games with your mouse and keyboard.
Yeah, it's funny. Like the top down games, like this one, where I can see in the middle of the screen where I am. Games that are isometric, I don't have as much problem with. It's when I have to like embody the character, or I'm essentially moving with them. I'm just so not used to. I never really played any first person shooters. I always shied away from when, GoldenEye first came out. I was like, oh God, I'm just no good at this. And so I just never practiced it. But I am getting better with that, and not so afraid of getting into the tactile, because I think with most games, it doesn't take too long to get to a point of comfort and familiarity. It takes a long time to master, of course, as with anything that is difficult. But the feeling of like, I think I know what I'm doing, usually doesn't take too long. And what I've realized, I think, is that when I start playing a new game, it's not 80 hours away. It's 2 or 3 hours away from a feeling of, okay, I know what I'm doing. I'm not great, but I'm not going to die right away. So yeah, and playing games like this or similar to it are helpful. Yeah. Okay, so I wanna talk about more games. What's next? What do you want to talk about next? And if you've got a game in mind, what would it be? If you don't, that's okay. We can pick one in the coming days. But what do you think? What would you like to try and talk about next? And it could be something you've already played.
Yeah, I mean, oh, if you just asked me that, but it might be a while still. Well, first of all, we do need to do Outer Wilds. I have gotten back to playing the DLC, so I'm getting close to being able to actually talk about that one. I really want you to play Hollow Knight as well, but I don't want. I think we should wait till Outer Wilds is done, because they're both, I mean, Outer Wilds is way less of an investment than Hollow Knight, because Hollow Knight is a longer game. But I don't think it makes sense to start one when you're still playing the other, just because they're both longer. I had an idea to talk about sort of the design process like the design process of coming up with a new game, say. Um, as someone who's thinking about this and what it would take to be a game developer, really just how do you go about that initial idea uh, and initial investigation. But in terms of another game, no, I feel like we have to do Outer Wilds soon. I feel like we just have to pull the trigger.
All right, let's do it. So let's talk about the design question. I think that's an interesting question and something we can dig into for an episode. So let's do that next. And then following that, there's no out now. We're going to do Outer Wilds. That will be the following episode. And then let's see if we can do either Hollow Knight following that or have another episode about something else or a shorter game that we can play that you can think of or I can think of, and then get to Hollow Knight. So design, Outer Wilds, something,
Something.
Hollow Knight. So gives us enough time. Gives us enough time to play because I would like to dig into. I'd like to get back into Outer Wilds and actually get to a point where I feel comfortable talking about what happens towards the end, and you've talked about Hollow Knight many times, and it's something that I've wanted to play, and I think I'm ready. I don't think I'm going to be too like, oh my god, it's too tactile or something. I think I'm ready for Hollow Knight. Okay, sounds good.